All right, hey everybody, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. I am going to take my screen off of screen share. All right, give me one moment to get adjusted here. All right, good morning or evening, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from. Thanks so much for joining us for our community composting webinar. My name is Aiko Fukuchi, and I'm really excited to be facilitating this webinar series, or this webinar currently. Yeah, so just to give you like a couple of quick orientation notes and logistical notes before we get started. So my name is Aiko Fukuchi. I'm the Gaia US and Canada Regional Program Associate. For anyone who's on the call who's not aware, just a quick overview. Gaia is a global network of organizations and individuals fighting to end incineration and also transition to zero waste systems. So in this webinar, we're going to be exploring community composting programs implemented in India, Ghana, and the United States. Experts are going to talk about different composting techniques and discuss lessons learned. So this webinar is also going to be an hour and a half, just so folks know up front. And I'm really excited to introduce our presenters to you all today. Before I do that, I want to do a couple of logistic notes. The first item I want to just touch base on is to remind folks that this webinar is being recorded. So a recording of this webinar is going to be sent out to everyone who registered for the webinar in a few days afterwards, so it can have a little time to process. The second thing to note is that all participants on this webinar are muted, and that is really just so we can keep with the flow of the programming in the webinar and make sure that our presenters have the time that they need to share their expertise. The third thing I wanted to note is we're going to have a section at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So if you do have any questions, that will be the time to ask them. So please hold on to your questions until the end, or you can type the questions into the Q&A box you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can type them in either when they come up or at the end of the webinar, but we're going to address them at the end. And one note, if you do have a question specifically for a specific speaker, just note that when you type in your question. And then the final note is just, if you do have any questions following the webinar, or if you just want to receive information about future webinars that Gaia is hosting, please email Gemma at no-burn.org. And Gemma or I are either going to put Gemma's email in the chat box to the side of your Zoom window. All right. So today's webinar, we have 3 speakers. So Shibu is going to talk about community composting techniques and experiences from India. Brenda is going to talk about community composting at a community level and large scale, experiences, successes, and lessons learned in the United States. And Desmond is going to talk about promoting community and home composting, experiences, successes, and lessons learned in Ghana. So really quickly, I'm going to read some of their awesome bios and share some of their work, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. So Shibu Nair is a consultant for designing, developing, implementing, and monitoring zero waste systems for communities, nonprofit organizations, and government. He has 25 years experience in environmental campaigns, research, projects, and policy advocacy. He has been involved in zero waste campaigns and projects since 2000 and has worked with organizations at local, national, and international levels. Shibu has held positions including Program Director for Zero Waste and Climate Change, Regional Advisory Committee Member for Gaia Asia Pacific, and Network Coordinator for Zero Waste Himalaya. Brenda Platt is the Director for the Composting for Community Project at Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C., United States. Brenda Platt leads the Composting for Community program at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where she has worked for more than 30 years promoting zero waste, non-burn solutions to trash. Her current focus is in advancing a locally based and distributed infrastructure that keeps resources and benefits circulating within local economies. She's authored numerous reports, including 2 reports produced in collaboration with Gaia, Stop Trashing the Climate and the Pitfalls of Incineration in the Global South. Her recent compost-related reports include Yes in My Backyard, a home composting guide for local government, Guide to Composting on-site at schools, Community Composting Done Right, A Guide to Best Management Practices. Brenda is nationally known for her work documenting the jobs through reuse, recycle, and composting. She is a trained composter and trains others. In 2017, the U.S. Composting Council awarded her its H. Clark Gregory Award for outstanding service to the composting industry through grassroots efforts. Desmond Alugnoa is a youth empowerment advocate with focus on community development, waste management, and climate adaptation. His work started in 2012, and he helped to build the capacity of youth and women in rural communities in Ghana by providing education and creating awareness about health threats posed by unsustainable ways of life in communities. Identifying environmental challenges as an opportunity to create decent jobs for women and youth, Desmond co-founded the Green Africa Youth Organization, also known as GAIO. In 2014, which is dedicated to providing solutions to pressing environmental issues through research and developing businesses out of environmental challenges. GAIO is currently promoting rural innovation through its sustainable community projects, which trains youth and women to convert waste into useful materials while providing avenues for traditional occupations to thrive in an era of digital revolution. Desmond's work targets to raise young entrepreneurs in rural communities and to limit the threats of climate change on clean water, forest cover, and food security by restoring landscapes. Desmond is also the West Africa thematic focal point for SDG 8 rural economy under the UN, major group for children and youth. He is also a member for several youth movements, including Youngo, which is the official youth constituency of UNFCCC, Young Youth in Landscape Restoration, YIL, among other regional and sub-regional groups. All right, so with that, I'm really excited to hear from all of these speakers. I think I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to you, Shibu, if you wanna take it off, or take it over. Thanks so much.
Hi, namaste. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because it's evening here in India. I am talking to you from India. And thank you, Aiko, for this brief introduction. I am very happy to be in this panel because my teacher is here, Brenda. I don't know whether she remembers it, because she was my teacher for my zero waste training in Berkeley. So where I started learning zero waste in my life. So it's always happy to be with in a panel with your teacher and colleagues and wonderful people around globe, especially from Gaia. So today I want to share with you about some facts. It's basically facts about composting. And I am talking from the perspective of composting in a tropical climate, because I experience more of a tropical climate, especially along the coast where humidity is also high. So my experience can be related to somebody else who is from the similar conditions. Like it varies, the experience varies with the kind of a climate. Like even in India, we have different climate scenarios where, like, I am from a coastal state, but I also do work with communities who are composting at sub-zero level. That's in Himalayas. It's a snow-covered villages. So it varies based on the climatic conditions, the sun, the moisture level in the air. So everything. So I'll just share a couple of slides on this. And then maybe I'll be happy to take some questions on that. Let me share my slides. Yes. Okay. So again, my name is Shibu. It's pronounced as Shibu, and I speak. My native language is Malayalam. So one about composting. See, people have they have different kind of notions about compost. One, it's basically it is the the decomposition process in the nature, and that is the base of life on earth. You have to recycle the organic material into soil so that the life can continue in nature. So it is the biological decomposition of organic matter to form humus-like material. And many people call compost as a kind of a fertilizer. And technically, especially when it comes in legal framework, compost is not considered as fertilizer. There are different reasons for it, because it is a kind of it's a question of debate. Like it is a debate for a long time whether compost is a fertilizer or not. But for the time being, let us just assume that compost is not a fertilizer, because you have to understand what is the difference between compost and fertilizer. So compost is fed to soil. It is a soil conditioner. It is a soil nourisher, which actually creates a kind of an ecosystem within soil so that it can actually support the plant growth. At the same time, fertilizer is actually something fed to the plants, and fertilizer, basically it is legally defined as a soil amendment that guarantees minimum percentage of nutrients. That's very important, because a fertilizer always guarantee a minimum percentage of nutrients. But when you do composting, you may not be able to guarantee that minimum percentage of nutrients, but you have to do some post-harvest process to make it like you can actually convert a compost into fertilizer, but you need to do kind of a value addition to that. So this is the basic idea about compost, or the kind of confusion people normally have about compost and fertilizer. So let us move on. Compost, if you look at the science of composting, it is all biology, and it is very complicated. So see, it involves a lot of microorganisms, especially bacteria, protozoa, fungi, rotifiers. So all these microbial organisms act together to convert the biological matter or the organic matter in our waste stream. It is not just in waste stream, it happens everywhere, every other minute, every second. Even now it is happening around us. The thing is that it's a complex process in nature which passes through different phases. It passes through different phases in the sense, see, it passes through different temperature levels. Like it starts with a low temperature, and the temperature goes high, and then it comes down. So it goes through different phases where it depletes the complicated materials in organic matter, like what you call the proteins, the cellulose, things like that. So it's basically like if you are going into deep, this is going to be very tough, at least for people who haven't learned biology in their schools. And like when you look at, like, normally people ask the question how to compost. When you ask the question how to compost, the thing is that it's very interesting to know that we know how to prevent composting or how to prevent decomposition, and do not know how to compost. So that is a scenario. See, every day in our daily life, we keep our wooden furniture dry because we don't want that get into like that to decompose into nature. See, we keep it clean, we keep it dry, or maybe we apply some paint or varnish, or you keep all your leather stuff polished or clean or dry so that you can prevent fungus. And we keep all our veggies inside a refrigerator so that it do not get like it is not getting decomposed or it is not rotten. So every day in our daily life, we are doing so many things to prevent decomposing, decomposing in our material, especially the organic matter. And for example, like if you look at meat, like some people preserve food, like meat, they salt it or maybe smoke it, or like pickling the vegetables or making jams. So all these things are actually, we are doing that because we want to preserve them from decomposition. So we know that a decomposition process is happening in the nature, around us on a continuous basis, and we know what are the things to be done to at least to preserve it for some time, or maybe for a year, maybe for 2 years or 3 years, things like that. So there we know what to do. And we also do some decomposition in our kitchen. For example, we ferment milk to make curd or butter. It's very common in any Indian kitchen to make curd, or even in Asian perspective, like fermented food is something very, it's a kind of a delicacy for our daily life. So we do culture bacteria, like we do culture bacteria in milk. or we do culture bacteria in batter, like a flour batter to make some breads. So and people also do that kind of a fermentation is also happening with to make wine or to make beer. So to have a beer means you used the or you utilize the service of some microbial or microbes in the nature, or you utilize the technology of composting or kind of a decomposition. Decomposition is a part of the composting process. So we know how to prevent and we know how to ferment. So composting is something in between. So that means you know it. It's not that you don't know. It already you know how to compost. So before asking question how to compost, you have to just ask whether you know how to ferment food, how to prevent decomposition. Then that means you know, like it is in between. You know how to manage your compost. So this is your control panel. Like when you look at the compost or composting process, okay, we don't know much about like the deeper ecology of composting, but we know that there are 4 major factors that if you just have your hands on that, if you have that enough experience with these 4 factors, okay, this is your control panel. If you can control these 4 things, then you will be able to manage your compost. So the major 4 things are: 1, air, because composting is basically an aerobic, we call it as aerobic composting, so it needs oxygen. So you need a lot of oxygen, you need aeration. And second, you need moisture. You have to maintain a minimum level of water, that between 40 and 50% of moisture level, that actually keeps the microbes live and that helps the microbes to decompose the material. And of course you need microbes. And when you say microbes, people suddenly ask, okay, where should I buy my microbe, or where can I find it? Okay, I will come back to it later. And we also need carbon, because the carbon is the battery. Carbon is the energy source for the microbes to convert the organic matter into compost and to complete the cycle of nutrients in nature. So let us look at the factors. See, air. The thing is that in a tropical climate, with the kind of atmospheric pressure, the penetration level of air, or the efficient penetration of air, is limited up to 60 centimeters. So when you want to do a perfect composting, the container or a tank or anything, whatever you take for like a kind of a vessel for composting, you need to ensure that its depth is not more than 60 centimeters. If the depth is more than 60 centimeters, then you have to make provision for aeration. You have to provide some air vents, or you have to provide some what you call pressurizing equipments or compressors to blow air into the pile of material. And or you have to layer it with the spongy materials like dry leaves or coconut husk powders or rice husk or the wood chippings, things like that. And second part is water, and I told you earlier, it needs, the moisture level need to be maintained at 50%, and it should not be too dry and it should not be too wet. It is very difficult to convey the idea of 50%, but it is always easy to tell people that, like, when you can actually feel that 50% of moisture. You take your organic material for composting, especially your kitchen waste, in your hand, for example the leftover food or whatever it is, you just take it on your hands, and if on holding it, if you are feeling that water is just oozing out, that means it is above 50%. And water is not oozing out, like if you are just crushing it and then you see couple of drops going out, that means it is almost 50%. So that is the level of that's the way you can actually identify whether your material is 50% moisture level or not. So it should not be not too dry or not too wet. If it is too wet, because where there is too wet, air will not penetrate. So aeration will not happen when there is more water. So that is a issue with more water in your compost. And when there is no aeration, the digestion process changes. From aerobic composting, it shifts to anaerobic digestion. And when it shifts to anaerobic digestion, it emits ammonia and hydrogen sulfide that stinks. So if your compost pile stinks, that means there is no aeration, and anaerobic digestion, the other process has started, and it emits ammonia, and methane is also coming out, but the smell is mostly from ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. And you need microbes for composting, and most of the time you can find them in nature. It's very easy to gather microbes for composting. The ideal way to do is that, especially in tropical countries where people have like animals like cows, we normally we use cow dung slurry, like you collect cow dung and then make a kind of a like you add water and make a slurry, and that liquid is used as a kind of an inoculum. We call it as an inoculum for composting because it supplies enough microbes for your composting process. And if it is not, like in some places you may not be able to find cow dung, so it's very easy. You just go to a big old tree, and then and beneath the tree on the topsoil you can find some humus, or you can find the topsoil part. You just gather maybe a cup full of topsoil, and that is rich in microbes that you need to do compost. Like you can just take that soil and you can use it, or you can sprinkle it over your material so that the composting will start, or composting will be faster. Or you can also make your own microbes by maybe the fermented milk. You keep the fermented milk out for say next 3 or 4 days, then it becomes a rotten kind of a milk, or it's very spoiled milk. That also have lactic bacteria. Or you can keep your bread in outside for say 1 week, then it will get maximum fungus. So that fungus can also help you in composting. So it's the thing is that you can find the fungus or the bacteria in nature, in your kitchen, or in your refrigerator itself. You can actually, if you just look at your refrigerator, inside the refrigerator there are something which you forget about it. You just stretched it for, and then you will find some fungus is there. So all these things actually contributes for as a kind of a microbial culture for your composting. So this is the way in tropical country, like in India, we use all these kind of like either it's a cow dung slurry, or it is a rotten curry, or it is other stuff. And then you need to supply it with carbon. See, carbon is very important because bacteria use carbon as an energy source to build protein for its cells. So 25 to 30 parts of carbon is needed for 1 part of nitrogen. Every food waste or every organic matter, you can actually call it as they say, it's a mix of carbon and nitrogen. In something, carbon may be higher level and nitrogen will be lower level. For example, juicy food items, especially cooked food or meat waste or fish waste, or they all have more nitrogen than carbon. And there are dry leaves or wood chips or things like that that actually have more carbon than nitrogen. So you have to maintain a balance. Like you need almost 30 to 25 to 30 parts of carbon, and then maybe 1 part of nitrogen. So to ensure that, you have to layer the compost with the dry leaves. So you maximum utilize your dry leaves in your backyard or on your roadside or the street side, or you can use like at the like even if you don't get enough dry leaves, in the worst case scenario, you can also use newspaper. You just shred the newspaper into smaller pieces, and that can be used as a kind of a carbon source. In a tropical country, we use more of a kind of a rice husk because we have a lot of paddy cultivation. So rice husk, or we have a lot of coconut trees. So we get coconut husk, and from the husk we get cocoa peat. It's a kind of a material that supplies carbon as well as it absorbs extra moisture. So these are the sources of major carbon. Or in places you can also look for say sawdust. We call it sawdust. Like it's you go to any wood industries, there you can find the powder of wood. That can be a kind of a source of carbon. So these are the 4 things where you manage them well. Like you ensure enough aeration, you manage the water level to 50%, and you use microbes, maximum microbes, and then you maintain the carbon level, then you can actually compost it. And to do composting, if you are looking for a composting equipment, normally people just go to the shop, or you just click on Flipkart or click on Amazon to buy composting vessels. But it's very easy to find it in your neighborhood. See, the 2 pots. This is where I actually personally started my composting. It's actually 2 earthen pots, normal earthen pots, and sitting over a plant pot. So where you can actually the earthen pot, the advantage is that they are breathable. Like they allow air to go in and out because they are porous. So you use earthen pot. So every day you have your waste in the pot, and then layer it with dry leaves. And for 20 or 25 days, you continue the process. And by 25th day, you just close it and start doing it in the next pot. And by the next 25 days, you will get the second pot full. and then that means your first pot is ready to harvest. So it's two bins you can actually use. Same way, you can also use pipe compost. These are the PVC pipes with 8-inch diameter and with some holes for ventilation at the top, and it is portable in that sense. And you can also buy some of these composting equipments, beautiful equipments like the earthen 3-part jars. They are called Kampa in India. Or you can also go for the plastic drums, the rotary drums, where that also actually improves composting. Like it also, like when you turn it round, that actually gives more aeration and more mixing of parts. And in India, see, it's a tropical country. We have different methods of composting. And we have we actually made that composting in a kind of like a lot of equipments are coming up in our daily market. So this is the latest one, that green 3-part plastic buckets. We call it as kitchen bin, and it's actually composting in the kitchen. We do composting in the kitchen. So you can, instead of a waste bin sitting in your kitchen, you keep this 3-part bin in your kitchen so that you can directly compost. Like, so the composting is that easy. And there are community composting models in the bottom. You can see the cement tanks. These cement tanks are, you can see there is no holes on the side, and it is a bit higher. So that use forced aeration method, where you have to use compressor to aerate it. And these are the fiber made portable large tube bin. These are used for flats, especially the flat, what you call the communities living in flats, where in the rooftop they will have 2 big bins so that they can manage food waste from minimum of 50 to 100 households. And this is one thing which I want to share a little bit more, because most of the composting process, wherever you go, you will see that people do turning it. Like you have to get somebody to just mix it every day, or on a, say, at least once in a week, you have to turn it to ensure enough aeration or for better composting. But see, this is the model which we use in Kerala. This is called, it's actually originated in Kerala. It's called Tumbur Muri. This composting do not need mixing or do not need turning. It's actually layered composting. It allows maximum aeration from all the sides, and you do layering. It starts with the 6-inch layering of dry leaves, and then 6-inch layer of food waste, and then again 6-inch layer, and in between you have to sprinkle the microbes. This is mostly used in municipalities or in the cities and on the roadsides. So if we do composting on the roadsides as a kind of a cluster composting, which can handle up to, each bin takes almost 50 kilograms of waste per day. So if you increase the number, it's a kind of a modular structure. You can increase the number, you can decrease the number. So based on the, so it gives you that kind of a flexibility of the size and capacity. In many places, people build like they construct a huge composting bin and then they wait for the material to come. But here it is not like that. You just start with one, and when the waste increases, you can assemble the next bin so that you can move on. Sorry. Sorry. I'm sorry. And these are, I'm just giving you some of the examples. Like there are beautiful models available out there in the market. For example, this is a jar type of plastic barrel where you can actually insert things from the top and you can take out the compost from the bottom. And this is a simple structure with fiber and metal where you can insert your waste from this side on the top and you can actually harvest the compost from the bottom. And this is again a completely closed fiber-based tank, but it gives aeration through added pipes inside. This is again another bin, and this is a simplest method you can see. This is a long rotary tank where you can do batch composting. These are for the households. Like in the household, we can have this kind of a beautiful drum things for composting. So you can start composting from a kind of ice cream cup. You can do composting, and you can find whatever like leftover utensils. It can be a paint bucket, it can be something else, or even it can be a pit on your ground to do composting. So it is not the thing is that you have to maintain that 4 things. You have to always remember about that 4 things. That is your control panel, air, microbial or the microorganisms, carbon and moisture. If you manage it well, then composting will be better. And If you are doing aerobic composting, normally people have a notion that composting means smell, it is stinky. No. If you do aerobic composting, there is no smell. In Kerala, where I live, in my city where we have 1 million population, we have composting plants on the busy streets. It is right on your bus stop, and people go there on a daily basis to give their waste for composting. So composting is actually, it is a kind of a, we are actually helping in the nature. We are actually contributing our role, or we are discharging our duty to maintain the cycle of nutrients. So that means composting, we have to celebrate. Composting is a kind of a celebration of life. It actually maintains, it actually supports life on our beautiful earth. So composting should be a kind of a, as a kind of a daily routine, whether it is for your entire waste or even for a small fraction of your waste. But please do practice composting. That is good for nature, and that is good for our climate, and that is our future. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Shibu. That was wonderful. If you want to go ahead and stop your screen share, and we can pass it over to Brenda. Brenda, if you want to, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Can you hear me? I'm just trying to go back. Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. And today I'm going to be talking about community composting in the United States. I have a lot of photos to share today, and I might not get through all of them, but it'll be on, Gaia will make the full presentation available. So Aiko, thank you for the introduction, and Shibu, thank you for the shout out. I consider myself a lifelong learner, and I learned quite a bit from you today. And I love how you presented how we all know how to do decomposition and composting already. I'm going to start using that. So thank you for that. As Aiko mentioned, we have a lot of reports that we've issued over the last number of years, including the one we did with Gaia, and sadly called Stop Trashing the Climate, which sadly is still relevant today as it was 10 years ago when we released it. But we have a number of resources on composting, and in addition to the reports, I want folks to know that we have infographics and posters that are available on our website. This is one of them showing the connection of composting to jobs, and they're available for free for download in several formats, and we have translated a number of them at request from folks into other languages. So some of them are available in Latvian, Polish, Arabic, and Spanish. So if you're interested in having it translated into your language, let us know. We may be able to help you. Compost is all about the soil. So this is my favorite poster that we've done, connecting the use of compost to the benefits to the soil. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because I really want to get into community composting activities. Oh, and that's a picture you can see of soil that's been amended with compost and how rich it is in organic matter. One of the things that we've done at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is really emphasize how important issues of scale are and keeping composting community-based. There's a lot of composting, and I'll have many pictures of community scale composting and not so much of the large scale composting, but really what we want to see is a hierarchy like this where we're reducing waste, preventing food waste to begin with. There's many ways to source reduced waste. Then we're rescuing edible food to feed people and maybe livestock, farmers' livestock, chickens and whatnot. And then after that, promote home composting as much as possible, particularly in people who have yards and can use the compost they produce. And then we want to see communities support small-scale, decentralized composting at community gardens, urban farms. And then following that, we want to see more the medium scale or municipally based, but large scale should be after we do all those things above. So centralized composting or anaerobic digestion, another biological process, which we're not really going to be talking today about, something that communities can do, and maybe ultimately we'll need some more centralized facilities, but that should not be the starting point. And then certainly mixed waste composting, which has been tried in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. Many of those systems fail because of contamination and other reasons. So they can help get the activity, energy out of the material, so when it ends up in a landfill, it's not producing methane, but really last resort. And of course, landfills and trash incinerators should be avoided at all cost. So that's our hierarchy, and as Shibu kind of showed at the end of his presentation with all of his wonderful photos, there are so many ways to do composting. We have no excuse not to do it, really. These are, this is showing a tractor pulling a turner at a farm. This is a small town I'm here in Maryland today, in the state of Maryland. This is from a small public works yard in Maryland. This is at a retreat center using these earth tubs. This is at a horse farm with bins, have a blower to get the air in. I'm going to talk quite a bit about these 3-bin systems. They're very popular in some of the communities I'm working in. And one thing you'll notice is that they're enclosed with this woven mesh, we call it hardware cloth in the United States, 1/4 inch, to keep out unwanted rodents, rats, mice. And so that's the idea. This is a smaller system in New York. This is a photo up here on the top, very popular in the US for large scale, these kind of long windrows. And you'll see quite a bit of that. And there's so many different systems. There are ones that are more expensive you can get that are enclosed, and they're not batch systems, so you don't have to fill them up and empty them. You can put the material in at one side and it comes out the other. This particular brand is called the Rocket. There's me with one of my many home compost bins in my backyard, but there's no one way to do it, and I think that's really the beauty of, one of the beauties of composting. I'm not going to talk a lot about farmers today, but they are so essential because they have equipment, they know how to use compost, they add it to their soil to grow food for us. This is one of the farmers I work with in Maryland, and here he is adding compost to build up the organic matter at his farm. And so this is another farm here in Maryland that's doing a great system, all organic farming, so it's key. So what I want to move into is some of the work that we're doing. My nonprofit, I have increasingly in the last few years been focusing on cultivating community composting, and we do national in-person forums. In the United States, we have a whole series of webinars just for community composters. We have a coalition, we have a listserv. If you're a community composter, please consider joining our coalition. We have 83 members in 24 US states, but we also have members in Canada and Lebanon and Costa Rica. So it's not just strictly the United States. We want to create a network and help facilitate more sharing of information. We had our last forum just last month in New York City, and we had 150 people there. We did training and site tours, and I'm going to share some stuff in New York. But one thing I'll just let people know is these are just some of the webinars we've been doing on community composting. They're all recorded. You can listen to them on your own time. So how to set up an entity. Bokashi is a pre-composting fermentation system. Policies in the US, we have one just on worm composting, which is very different than hot composting. So check out some of those resources. If you go to our website, ilsr.org/composting, you'll find these resources. On the right, it says composting resources. Scroll down to where it says webinars and click on that, and you'll find them, as well as our charts and graphs and some of our other stuff. So one of the things we did just last month is we've launched this new interactive online composting for community map. It does just focus on the US, but it would be great at some point to go international. But we have, and we're building it out, so it's going to be populated more and more every day, so keep coming back to it. But you can click on community composters, you could look at worker-owned cooperatives, the bike haulers, urban farms, and then we're also kind of tracking state and local policy that supports community composting. So that's a resource that we hope you'll check out. So there's different ways to compost, but what exactly is community composting? And I like to say that it's the not so radical idea that compost is used within the same community where the material is generated, and that the community participates in some way. So many times in the US, we collect food scraps from households or businesses, and they're transported miles and miles away at these industrial sites, and the community is not educated, they're not engaged in any way. So community composting really supports the community. We did this report a few years ago called Growing Local Fertility, a guide to community composting. And in that report, we laid out some key principles for what constitutes community composting. And scale is important, that you're using the compost locally, that you're supporting the community, and that you're engaging and empowering and educating the community. We also identified about 10 different types of community composting, and you can be in more than one of these categories. So you could be a worker-owned cooperative, and you could also be collecting on bikes, and you can also be doing it at schools. So on-site composters are those, let's say you're at a school and you're composting on site, and off-site composters, maybe you're collecting your material from somewhere else and you're composting it off-site and doing that. There's so many micro haulers now, so these collection entrepreneurs are growing. I'm going to share some pictures of those. But before I do that, I just want to share that our latest report we just issued last month, a couple of months ago in March. It's called Community Composting Done Right, and it's a guide to best management practices. We also did a webinar on it, so please check that out. And one of the things that we do, like our posters and graphics, is we have some new illustrations we had done, and we've made all of those, most of them available individually for you to download and use. And they're in black and white, so it makes it easy to copy. So just want to make sure people know that. This, I think, illustrates what we're talking about with the closed loop of community composting, where you eat food, you generate it, you collect it, you have a micro hauler collecting it. If it's not done on site, you take it to a small scale system. Then the compost is used locally to grow more food, sold at a farmer's market, for instance, and then you eat it, and that's the cycle. And you're keeping those resources locally. Subbu touched on this. The report, Subbu touched on the key ingredients for good compost, and in the report, Composting Done Right, we go into a lot of detail, but you need, as he said, the water, the air, and the carbon. We in the US often refer to the nitrogen-rich materials as greens because they tend to be more green materials, and the carbon-rich materials browns, like leaves and wood chips and the shredded newspaper. The report also goes into some detail on the common steps in the community composting process. So you want to collect and store your browns. You don't never store food scraps, by the way. You want to track your data. You need to chop large materials to make it easier for the microbes to decompose it. We promote mixing the feedstocks and building your pile if you can. It just helps really jumpstart things. Water is so important. We have a lot of information on troubleshooting, and compost has to cure. You need space for curing the compost, and then sometimes that can take 2 months to it's really mature. And then one of the last steps is sifting it. Not absolutely necessary, but if you can sift it to different sizes, that can, and then you can, the overs, the pieces that are too big, you can put back in your pile, and then you can store it for use. These are two resources that I think every community composter should have. They were both released in the last 6 months. One is the Worm Farmer's Handbook, and Rhonda Sherman. This covers international. So she has systems in Chile and India, and so check that out. And this one by my colleague, James McSweeney, just goes into so many different systems and things to keep in mind, and it's like 400 pages. So both of these reports are amazing. Now I'm going to switch to some of the what's going on in the United States, and I will just say that New York City is an amazing model of community composting. Not only are there more than 200 community composters in this city of, you know, several million people and very urban area. So if New York City can do it, my goodness, we can do it anywhere in the world, really. And the city really supports it, and I think their outreach is amazing. It's, you know, really focused on, we're going to compost it locally. So this is a map. It's a few years old, just showing how distributed these sites are throughout all 5 boroughs of New York City. And one of the things they do is they support education and outreach and training at several sites, and including botanical gardens and as well as nonprofits. And this one I just want to share is the Queens Botanical Garden, and they have, you know, a demonstration site, they have signage, they have a showing how to use it. It's on a path where people can pass. Education is so important. I hope we have an opportunity to talk about more about the training. Get trained is something I'll just share, one lesson learned. This is a community urban farm in Brooklyn, New York, and they have volunteers that are building the windrows. They also have a system called an aerated static piles where you can't really see it. This is the blower house, but the blowers have pipes going through these piles to get the air in. This windrow, by the way, which is hand-built by volunteers, had 4 to 6 tons of food waste. So volunteers can do it. And they're really doing a lot in growing food and training youth. Okay, so I only have a few minutes. I'm going to fly through some of these photos. So one of the things we're seeing huge growth in the U.S. is bike-powered collection, which I think is very exciting. BK Rod is a youth-engaged one that's collecting with youth in Brooklyn, New York, and composting on site. We're seeing more worker-owned cooperatives, and CERO is one in Boston where the workers own the business and they're collecting and taking it to farms. Schools, absolutely, we should be doing so much more at schools to engaging the next generation. My next report, with any luck, will focus on schools, and we'll be able to share this. This is one southeast of Los Angeles where the kids are involved. So many ways to do it. This is a rocket composter, another school. I love this one because the parents and the teachers built it. It's in the shed, and they're handling all the food scraps. This is a site in Vermont in a rural area. Universities, this is St. John's University in New York City. They're doing it on site, handling all the food scraps from the dining hall and then using it in their farm on site in the school, which of course then the food goes back into the dining hall that they grow. EcoCity Farms is a community composter I work with a lot in Maryland, and Benny is one of my mentors and trainers, and I know he's been to Ghana and trained composters and been to Palestine, so he is available to come and help you set up if you need trained experts. We helped launch this Baltimore Compost Collective in Baltimore, also in Maryland, at a community garden, and again, this is the system we're using, and it's engaging youth and employing them. So I love that. DC, Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, the Department of Parks and Recreation is supporting community composting. So it's an example of municipally supported composting. They have 56 gardens that have that 3-bin compost knock system. I actually am a compost manager at one of the sites, but anybody can take a 1-hour training, earn the right to drop off their food scraps, and then come drop it off and help volunteer. And it's all volunteer-based work, help work the compost, empty the bins, use the compost. It's very effective. There's also some of the haulers like Compost Cab can deliver at some of this network of community sites. And the city is also collecting food scraps at farmers markets, which is something they learned from New York City, which has more than 50 drop-off sites throughout all of those 5 boroughs. This is one of the ways that New York City is collecting food scraps for all those community composting sites I shared. And I just want to emphasize that low tech works too. This is a drop-off site in Florida by one of our nonprofit network members, and she just uses a series, as you can see in this photo, of home composting bins, and people get trained, and she tracks how much food waste is diverted. In New York City, one of the reasons the program is so successful is they have been operating a master composter training program for like 20 years, and they've trained an army of compost advocates. They have more than 2,000 people trained, and so that has led us to launch a neighborhood soil rebuilders composter training program that it can be replicated and adapted in other cities. We've brought it to Atlanta in the United States, Lincoln, Nebraska, Baltimore, I mentioned before. And so as part of this training, we are teaching people how to build their own bins. People have never used tools, by the way. It's really fabulous to have people pick up a tool for the first time. We're showing how to build piles and water as you build it. Often people water on top, but that sheds the water. You've got to get the moisture in the middle. We teach compost monitoring and testing as part of the project. We also have a session on worm composting, vermicomposting. There's Benny again, teaching worm composting. We do mini workshops on how to build screens and do the bokashi and make signs together. So, and then community engagement is really important. So we teach our compost operators how to engage the community in the process. And then we think demonstration sites are really important. So places where you can bring elected officials and other investors and other community members to show how you do it right. And then I'll just wrap up in just 1 minute with some of our lessons learned. So we are really promoting best management practices. So we would like people to keep records, keep data, monitor temperatures, turnings, and weights. Temperatures, I often say there's 2 most important tools for composting. One is your nose. If it smells, you know something's going wrong. And then tracking temperatures can tell you if you're killing pathogens and things like that. And so, and you don't want weed seeds to germinate. So if you're reaching 150, this is Fahrenheit, sorry, for those, most of the rest of the world on Celsius, but if you're at 154 degrees Fahrenheit, you've killed your tomato seeds. Consider space needs. You need room to store browns. You need room for to cure the compost, to store finished compost, to handle water, to move around, to breathe. So think about that. You want to secure adequate carbon. You need to store it. These are different ways to store carbon that we're seeing at some of the sites. This is some examples. I show this one because it's a little messy, and it really does help if you keep it neat, because people smell with their eyes. So if your site is neat, you'll get more people supporting what you're doing. At Red Hook Community Farm in New York, they would store their carbon like this, and this can be like kind of cluttered, which rats like, and they've moved to keeping leaves in these kind of rat-proof bins. So just think about that. How will you mix? A concrete pad is nice. You can make a donut, mix the food waste, and then put it in the bin. There's no one way. These are other examples of how to mix. And I don't have time to talk about how to manage critters, but as the climate warms, unfortunately, we're going to have more rats. So come back and look at our report to see how to avoid, how to avoid rodents. And there are many simple best management practices to do that. There's some videos on how to do that. You can Google. This is a 7-minute video, which is fabulous. Do you want to sift or screen? You can make your own screeners. This one is not particularly efficient, but people love it. Kids love a bike-powered sifter, and you can just go online and find do-it-yourself systems. And one of the things I love about Red Hook is, if they have a volunteer walking in, and whether they're 5 years or 85 years old, they have buckets of finished compost ready to sift. So you can always put a volunteer ready to work, and there's many ways to sift and sifters, so easy to make. And then I'll just end. I think this is the last slide, Aiko, is just having clear signage and instructions, and you can make your own signs, what to include and what not to include. You can print them, you can have them made, but there's no one way to do the signs. Just have a sign, make it fun, like this one, it's curing, don't add more material, it's sleeping. And directions for people are really, really helpful. And there's my contact information. So I will stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brenda. That was so interesting. All right. I think we're going to move on to Desmond. And Desmond, Again, you have about 15 minutes, so feel free to just go ahead and share your presentation, and I'll pass it along to you. Thanks.
So hi everyone. Like Aiko mentioned, my name is Desmond and I work with the Green Africa Youth Organization. A small organization and youth-led, so we have a slightly different approach to composting. And so most part of the introduction of my slides have been done by the previous presenter, so I'll just go straight to the other components that have not been mentioned. So we have a kind of a slightly unique problem in Ghana, which have to do with a lot of the people's already imbibed culture of handling waste, disposing waste. And these two pictures are actually from the capital city, and they are equally not different from those that you would find in the pre-urban and the rural areas. So we started by tackling the behavior, the character aspect of households by teaching them and then helping them to practice this composting so they could understand the reason why they need to do it. So with this, our initial approach as a bunch of students who have environment background and have been practicing on our own houses, we started household to household, and a lot of people understood how it should be done. However, we had quite a number of challenges because with limited capacity, most of the composting pits are always open, in open space. And even though the households we thought understood and they were willing to practice, every time it rained, we had these challenges of the pits collapsing, and then sometimes they call us to come and advise them what way to go. And another challenge too was that we were trying to practice this in really big cities where a lot of people didn't have the opportunity or the space to compost and to utilize the compost. So we educated them and then encouraged them to give it off to the people who have backyard gardens. So the collection strategy then was for a group of number of households to one household that is nearby and have the capacity to utilize the compost, because ourselves, the initial intention was not to sell this compost. And then, so this approach, those were some of the challenges. In some cases, we had to actually convert some of our waste bins that we use for collection into composting equipment. So you can see one of these, which we used to use as a waste collection bin, we had to convert it. But we needed to continue to promote composting in communities and promote composting in households. So we kept practicing and kept also adding new strategies. One other thing that became more of a challenge in Ghana, and this is not too different from some other West African countries, is that we realized a bunch of the organic waste were hard to decompose, and not only hard to decompose, they became the most valuable if we were to look at it in a different perspective. So, okay, we encourage every household to compost, but they were asking a lot of questions. So what happens to this other waste, and then how can we make use of it? But then these were beyond the capacity of household level. So we have to migrate this into schools, and also later by handling the waste management directly ourselves. Part of those waste is what we are seeing here. We have so much of coconut in Ghana, and that comes with this waste that takes quite a long time to decompose. Now, one other way that we encouraged people was to utilize it as to compost it in a very long-term manner, but these were not to be composted stand alone, because if you compost it alone, it doesn't come with the quality that the people are used with, and it doesn't come with the quality that is really okay. And then there's a need to further add other additives to make sure that it has the necessary nutrients. So what we did was to redesign our approach to make sure that we directly participate in composting, and we have modules that we can show to the communities how to do it. And then we can then form groups in these communities and empower them with a small land space so they can continue to do it wherever our coverage was not. So we designed this, and if you can see somewhere here, this is a whole infrastructure. This area is the compost, and these lanes are all composting pits. And then some of the communities really, there's still a lot of open defecation. So as an incentive, we realize that it is necessary to attach a compost toilet. And then also, apart from getting something little from it to sustain the project, we also solve a lot of the problems and tell the people you can actually convert this to something useful. The other component is that we decided that, okay, they had to decompose organics. So we divided organics into two. They had to decompose, and they're easily decompostables. So they had to decompose. We decided to use it to make charcoal briquette, because charcoal fuel is still highly used in Ghana. And we already also have the technology to do that. So we felt it is easy to leverage on our knowledge. So this part is the charcoal briquette for the design that we had. And then when you break it down, you're gonna have this part is where the composting is. This structure actually started in March. So this was the beginning when we started. This was how it looked like. And these ones, as you are seeing them, are the composting pits, the improved ones, other than the ones that we were practicing in the households. At that point, we were still using our old waste base and the old strategy of collection, where we combine households and then we give waste to other people. But by then, we were having those challenges. So now, the other challenge that we also used to have was that those 240 and 170 liter bins that we were using, they were plastic and kind of easy to carry. So we had a weird challenge where people were taking these bins home, and households keep complaining that the bin is being taken, and 2 or 3 households came out and they couldn't get the bin to deposit their waste. So we had to improvise and then make locally made bins that are having a larger capacity, because one thing was that these bins also get full so quick. And then we made these bins with a local architect. Now these bins are about 640 and then 520 liters. And then they come in different colors for hard to decompose organics and also easily compostables. We have other bins that we retain for only plastics and all other kinds of waste. So now with these bins, we are able to collect enough waste, but we still not having enough, because we have a bin to 40 households, which is okay, but with our previous strategy where we collected these organics 3 times in a week, now there are some of the communities where we actually have to collect this 4 times in a week, and even in some situations whereby somebody makes a mistake and then it rains into the bins, they don't close it and it rains, we have to go and collect it as an emergency strategy. But with this, now we have enough to compost, and then we set up 2 farms. Now these 2 farms started in 2018, and we call them the Sustainable Community Farms. Now these 2 farms were for the pilot of the project to apply our compost strictly on these farms, and then use it as a demonstration farm for the communities. So we had the cassava farm and we have the maize farm. And then we also had 3 additional farms situated in schools. Now we also taught schools how to compost their waste, how to segregate and compost their waste. So it was another strategy to ensure that they actually get the opportunity to practically use the compost that they generated. So it will be an encouragement for them to always segregate, even if we leave them on their own one day. With the hard to decompose, we brought and trained 7 women, and then these 7 women, we train them and provide them the machinery to convert this hard to decompose waste organics into charcoal briquette. These hard to decompose basically come from the coconut waste, plantain, palm nut shell, rice husk, and in a number of communities, sawdust, because we use the sawdust to aid our composting process. But we have so much of it that even if it takes in a week, the amount of sawdust that you have brought, that is being brought, there's no way that we can use it. So we have to add it to the other waste and then make sure that we turn it into the charcoal briquette. Now, this charcoal briquette aspect is seems to even be gaining more attention because so much of the waste comes and then it goes into this, whilst we just have the soft waste, vegetables, and then food waste in most parts of the communities, because there are a lot of communities that do not do animal farming, so we have to use the food waste as well in this. This does come with a lot of challenges also, but yeah, that is what we are doing now. This is a picture of some of the farms we had in the schools. So that was a sowing season, and then the students were sowing. So they were also practicing agriculture, which is not part of their curriculum. So we just had to find a way to work with the district to make sure that they had time for it. So far, we had, okay, before that, some of the challenges that we had with the composting aspect was that we also had problem still with the segregation. We have been doing this in the households and then now at the community level, but there are still a number of people who combine quite a number of the household waste, and then it makes it very difficult. So when a compost is supposed to mature in 6 weeks, we end up not having to sheet this compost because we don't collect bones as part of the food waste, actually. Now, what happened is that most of the households still do it, and sometimes we have 2 men who are in charge of going through the compost, the waste, when it is brought to the site. But then there are times that these things are embedded and you can't get them out. So during the composting, when you turn it over, then you realize that. So that's still a bit of a challenge that we keep educating the people. But so far, we have chalked a number of successes, even though this community level has been only for 4 months. We have been able to compost over 300 kg of this soft or easily degradables. And then for plastics, we have quite even more than this 10,000 plus that I have here. But we have several use for the plastics, which also was an innovation that came out later because we are a small group and we struggle sometimes financially. So we kept improving the ways to be able to generate income. So we started using the plastics to make raincoats, using the plastics to make school bags. And we have a lot of this kind of plastic in Ghana because we package water in such sachets. So that is a component that is worth mentioning in this presentation, because if you go strictly only compost organics, you might not be able to sustain in most cases where I'm coming from. And then we converted the hard to degrade to charcoal briquette, which is also really selling high than the normal charcoal, because this is not so staining, and then we also market it with the green words, so it becomes quite easy for people to come asking for it. But in all, we have 6 women and then 2 men who are permanently employed for this. That has never happened for us before, because like I kept mentioning earlier on, we don't have enough capacity in terms of human, the numbers, and in terms of finances. But immediately we scaled up to this level, then we were able to make sure that at least there is a component of the project that is able to sustain to some extent. Now we have few more challenges, as in being able to move beyond the communities we are working with. Right now, our much concentration is a district capital called the Adansi South District, but we had started in Accra, and we had to move all our effort to this district because there was so much of problems in Accra that our limited capacity, it was not the right place for us to continue this. So here comes the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank all of you.
Thank you, Desmond.
Thanks so much, Desmond. That was awesome. All of your presentations were so great. I'm really grateful I got to be here for them. All right, so I think we're going to switch into question and answer, that portion of the webinar. So it looks like there's one question right here in the chat for Desmond. And then if anyone else has questions, please type them into either the chat or the Q&A box, again, down at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, you might have to click on more, and then you can see Q&A and you can click on it there. So there's this one question, which is, which process is used to convert agricultural waste into charcoal? I think that was from your presentation, Desmond. I don't know if you want to take that.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. So it's actually quite a simple process when we started, but then that simple process also comes with quite a number of problems. So we also kept improving. You first of all, once you have your waste, you need to make sure that the waste is segregated really well. That is, if you are having the coconut husk, the palm kernel, and the rice husk, it has to be only that. You don't have to add other really soft waste, because it needs to dry to some extent for you to be able to decarbonize it. So the first thing is you have to decarbonize this in a closed claim, and that was part of the problem, because we started with you converting drums, metallic drums, into these claims, and it was okay, but there was still a lot of smoke coming out, which ideally is not healthy for us and for the women involved and for the environment as a whole. So we decarbonize in a closed claim, and then from decarbonization, we have to actually smoothen the char. When you decarbonize it into char, then you grind it, Then after you grind it, you now have to mix it with starch or any binding material. And then after you mix it, you bind it. So we have the machine for the binding, and we had the cleans, which were metallic cleans. And then we didn't have a crusher, the one that will grind it. And so we started with having these women have a really big space of a stone or sometimes woody mortar, and then we pound it. And that was not taking so much energy because the char is not hard, but it was taking so much time, and we couldn't be efficient with such a model. So we had to find other ways to get a crusher. Now, the crusher is quite expensive, so we also improvise again locally, which we are now using, which is not really efficient, but is only better than manually crushing. And then once you crush, you bind with this, the binding agent. So in our case, we have farms, which we call the sustainable community farms. And then we are encouraging the communities to do the same thing. So we use starch from cassava, which come from some of our farms. And then sometimes we source it from outside. And then we use it as a binding material. And then we have a binder, which is also manual, but that is a really heavy equipment that we have on site that binds it. Then it takes half a day, and sometimes when the weather is not so good, it takes a full day or even 2 days to dry and be ready for use. And yeah, so that is actually the process.
Thanks, Desmond. All right, so as we wait to see if there are any more questions coming in, I wonder if any of the presenters have questions for each other about each other's presentations. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions if you do.
I'll ask a question. This is Brenda. Desmond, I know you mentioned in Accra there were some problems. Can you just briefly tell us what those were? With the composting, you had to move it out of the city?
Okay, so in Accra, people understood how to compost, which was really good. And then we were having few people who were having the space in their houses to compost. But we as an organization couldn't afford any space in Accra. So for a lot of households and we have about 65%, and recent publication was that we have 67% of organics in Ghana and in the capital city. So having so much loads of this that the households that had space could not contain, it was necessary for us to have space to come in and then utilize this and also make it even sustainable. However, it is so expensive, in Accra for us to get space. And it is quite expensive to have volunteers in Accra. They are available, but you can't be a broke organization and be able to finance a volunteer daily movement around. So we realized that Accra is a really fertile ground for us because we also do a lot of stakeholder engagement, and that is where we can actually get the name we want to get and be able to create the influence for people to replicate. But with this, it is very difficult for you to survive in Accra. So we had to just leave and then continue to go to these households and encourage them to keep on doing what we taught them to do. And those that have the capacity to compost, we keep also educating them. And we later on also rolled some embassies like the German embassy and the Swiss to also practice the same thing, but they don't create so much waste. So sometimes we collect their plastics and then we help them to do the composting on site, and then we transport the plastics again. So those were some of the challenges we had in Accra. It's basically about capacity.
Yeah, and I'll just say in the U.S., which is so different than where both of you are operating, because here, either cities or businesses are paying for trash collection. So when a collection, food scrap collection, organic service, you know, can offer. That's how our enterprises are making money. They're charging for the collection, which often you can't do in a country like Ghana. There's no collection infrastructure. But we are seeing in the US, you know, either you're trying to make money and be a self-sustaining enterprise, or you're more volunteer-based, where you have to manage the volunteers, have it not all be on one person's shoulders, try to spread out the work. And so that's why we're incorporating more and more the community engagement and teaching the operators and the managers to how to, you know, engage their community and spread it out. And here in the US, like in order to graduate from high school, each student needs to have, like, it depends on which state you're in, you know, and school system, but you need like 70 hours to graduate, community service hours. So we're working with some schools to try to set up the volunteer time for students to earn their community service hours to graduate high school, to get credit for that by doing the volunteer composting. And kids love the hands-on activity and owning a project. So I don't know if that's just one thing we're trying to spread more in the United States. But managing volunteers, as you mentioned, is one of your challenges, and keeping them engaged is an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, yeah. It's basically one of our problems. But in Ghana, we actually have a lot of schools are also available. I forgot to mention that we have a high school with about 5,000 students that has really subscribed to this, and they are totally, we declare them zero waste school, and they are really doing well. But yeah, because we are all volunteers, kind of, so we need to be able to sustain ourselves and sustain whosoever is willing to help.
Great, thanks so much, Desmond and Brenda. So it seems like we don't have any more questions, so this might be a good time to wrap up. I just want to thank one more time all of our speakers for joining us and sharing all of your knowledge. This has been a really great space, and I'm really excited to have it just on our records and as a recording for a future resource for the rest of our Gaia membership and network. So thank you all so much. Just as a quick reminder, Gaia is going to be sending out more materials and information about upcoming webinars in July soon, so stay tuned. And again, if you do have any questions that pop up in your head after this, or anything like that, feel free to email Gemma at gemma@noburn.org. And then finally, this recording and also presentation materials will be sent out probably next week, if not a little bit earlier. So stay tuned for that. All right, thank you all so much.
No, you're welcome, or my pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing, and yeah, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.